Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into an insider's account of the U.S. trade war. And let me tell you, it's a story all about how a superpower's entire strategy was apparently built on a house of cards, a foundation of really critical errors. You've probably heard this one before, right? Know your enemy and know yourself. It's that classic wisdom from Sun Tzu. Well, that quote is pretty much the key to this whole story, because according to our source, when it came to this test, the United States, it failed big time. So who's our guide through all this? His name is Sean Stein. And look, this guy isn't just some talking head on TV. He's a true insider. We're talking about someone who was on the front lines representing American businesses in China. And his argument, it's pretty stark. He says the entire U.S. trade war strategy was, well, doomed from the get-go, all because it was based on some really fundamental factual errors about China. So Stein basically boils it all down to 4 core miscalculations. Yeah, just 4. 4 fatal flaws in thinking that ended up shaping a policy with, massive global consequences. All right, let's break them down one by one. Okay, so these are basically the 4 shaky pillars that this whole policy was built on. First, the belief that China couldn't really hit back. Second, that U.S. economic pressure was this all-powerful weapon. Third, this idea that the Chinese government was super fragile. And finally, that the U.S. was the only market in the world that actually mattered. Now here's the kicker. Every single one of those assumptions, completely, profoundly wrong. So let's start with that first error. It was this, honestly, dangerously simplistic belief that China's retaliation just wasn't a real threat. I mean, Stein actually recalls hearing this directly from senior officials. And this was happening even as the business community was screaming from the rooftops warning about specific vulnerabilities, things like China's control over rare earths. But those warnings, they just went completely ignored. Okay, number 2. This was a massive overestimation of U.S. leverage. The thinking in Washington basically went like this. We'll just hit them with tariffs and economic pressure. They saw it as a kind of silver bullet that would just force Beijing to bend to their will. But here's the reality check. And it's a big one. Direct trade with the U.S., it accounts for less than 3% of China's total GDP. Think about that. Less than 3%. So that huge economic hammer Washington thought it was swinging, it was, in reality, just a fraction of what they imagined. All right, on to the third error. And this one, well, Stein himself calls it baffling. It was this pervasive belief deep inside the White House that the Chinese Communist Party was somehow fragile, that it would just, buckle under all that external pressure. But of course, the exact opposite happened. The pressure from the U.S. triggered a classic rally around the flag effect, and Stein saw this with his own eyes. He says that even the business elites in China, the ones who are normally pretty pro-U.S., they rallied in support of their own government against what everyone saw as American aggression. The policy completely backfired. And that brings us to the 4th and final error. And this one was just a stunning failure to understand how modern global business actually works. The administration was working under this assumption that the U.S. market was the be-all and end-all, the only one that mattered. But the reality? For so many major U.S. companies, the global market outside the U.S. is way, way more important. So you've got these 4 huge miscalculations, right? Well, they all collided with reality in this one single moment that is so perfect, it's almost comical. So let's set the scene. From the very beginning, China's message was crystal clear. Seriously, they couldn't have been more consistent about it. They said over and over again, look, we'll negotiate with respect, but we will not beg, and we will not be bullied. Okay, so with that in mind, when the first round of tariffs actually hit, what did the White House do? They confidently went to the press and said, hey, expect a call between the 2 presidents any minute now. They were fully 100% expecting this panicked, apologetic call from Beijing. And so, the world waited. You can just picture the press corps, right? Just watching the clock. 24 hours go by, nothing. Then 36 hours, still nothing. No news from the People's Daily, no triumphant announcement from the White House, just silence. So according to Stein, his team finally asked the White House, hey, what's the deal with that call? And the response they got back was just full of genuine surprise. They said, the funniest thing? The Chinese, they didn't call. And that one moment just perfectly captures the disconnect, doesn't it? It was a complete shock to Washington, but it was totally predictable to anyone who had actually been listening to what China was saying. So this fundamental failure, this inability to know the adversary, it led to a totally predictable series of escalations. And in the end, the consequences were profound and, frankly, self-harming, especially for the American economy. So how exactly did it backfire? Well, think about it. The tariffs on Chinese materials basically made the US a really high-cost place to manufacture things for the rest of the world. So instead of that dream of bringing jobs back home, American companies actually started moving manufacturing jobs overseas to places like Malaysia and Thailand, just so they could stay competitive on the global stage. And maybe the most alarming part of this whole thing comes from a story Stein tells. He met with a top European CEO who told him his company was completely shifting its global strategy. Why? Because of the unpredictability coming from the US. He said they were moving to a new model in China, for China, and the world -1. And guess who the -1 was? Yep, the United States. So, as Sean Stein puts it, and it's a pretty sober conclusion, America went through all the economic pain, all the disruption of a trade war. But because the entire strategy was built on false premises, it got absolutely none of the upside, none of the strategic gains it was supposed to achieve. You know, this powerful report from an insider, it's not just a history lesson. It leaves us with some really critical questions that we should probably be asking ourselves right now, today. First off, are we still making these same mistakes? Are we still operating under these same flawed assumptions? I mean, think about how we talk about China today. Do we still underestimate their ability to retaliate? Overestimate our own leverage? Misjudge their resilience? Do we still act like the global market doesn't exist outside our borders? And here's a second, deeper question. When a major policy is proven to be built on, a foundation of factual errors, is it really enough to just say, okay, that policy was bad? Or do we have to look deeper? Do we have to examine the kind of institutional arrogance, maybe even ignorance, that allowed those mistakes to become official doctrine in the first place? And that brings us to the final and maybe the biggest question of all. After this incredibly costly experience, has the lesson actually been learned? Or does the United States still run the very real risk of harming itself by failing, yet again, to truly know its adversary?